What is up? Daniel here with the Virtual Robotics Studio. We're back with the next step of our chassis build. It's time to assemble and grease our transmissions. So you're going to need 4 of these sim motors. That's the black ones. They come in this sort of like cardboard box like this. So look for 4 of those. They were in the gray tote for me, so you should be able to have 4 of those there. I think you have an extra 1 or 2 in the black tote, but I guess they're all the same, so grab whichever ones you want. And then from our Andymark box, we are getting these 2 baggies. They've got a big black plastic piece in them, kind of a big shaft. You can see gears and motors, but these bags have everything we need to assemble the transmissions. And I think the only thing we need is a 5/32 hex key, and then maybe some shop rags to clean up the grease. All right, let's get these assembled, but before we start, a special thank you to Argosy for making this all possible, to First and Andymark for their parts and support, and to Team 302, Lake Orion High School, for hosting our studio. Okay, one thing to note as we're doing this, we have 2 transmissions that we have to build. So if you have 2 people, you can make both of them at the same time. And that kind of goes with a lot of the video series, right? While we're working on the chassis, these transmissions right now, you could jump ahead a few steps. Cutting and prepping parts for the upper structure can be done at the same time. So it just depends on how many people you have. But I'm going to go ahead and open up one of these bags and get the pieces out. All right. And we've got a little bit of a hardware bag here that we're going to need in a second. Go ahead and open up the gear bag. We definitely are going to need those first, or almost first. And then let's get the bearings and our grease out of the other bag. Okay. So a couple things to note about this transmission housing. This is the housing that's going to hold everything together. You'll note that one side is flat. One side sort of has a rounded point on it. The rounded point is going to be the bottom of the robot. The flat side is going to match up with the top of the robot. So you might want to put this in an orientation that makes sense to where like the bottom is facing you or whatever it is. Okay. Now, if you look inside here, there are 4 big holes. And the 2 on the sides, these 2 on the sides, that's going to be where we attach our motors. And the motors are going to come up through those holes. Then the 2 big ones in the middle, those are going to be the main, basically the main shafts that are going to hold our gears. And the one on the bottom is then going to have the really big shaft that goes out and it connects to the wheels and drives all the wheels on the drivetrain. So those 2 middle holes need bearings first. And we have 4 different bearings here. We can tell which is the right bearings for this step because if you look at the side of the bearing, it's flat all the way across. There's nothing sticking out. Whereas some of the bearings, like this really big one, for example, has this little bit that's sticking out, this little extra bit. We call that a flange. So this one is a flanged roller bearing, and this one is just a roller bearing. That flange is, like if we're pressing it into something, that flange is going to help hold it in place. But in this case, we're just dropping it into the hole, and we don't want the flange at all. So there should be 2 bearings that do not have a flange that are the same size. There's a third one, which I think is the same size hole in the middle, but does have the flange. So don't get that one. Save the 2 flanged bearings for later. And we're going to take the 2 bearings that we have and just drop them into those 2 holes. And they should press in pretty easily. They should just drop right in. So one of them on what's going to be the bottom of our transmission and one towards the top. Okay, then the top hole, the side that's flat, we're going to take this little shaft. It's round on the ends, but it's a hex shape in the middle. And that should drop right into the bearing that we put in. And again, that one should go on the top, on the flat side of the transmission. Then on top of that, we're going to take the biggest gear. So we have a bunch of gears here to choose from. And really quickly, the 2 very small gears, these are going to go on the motors later. So those will set off to the side. We don't need these right now. Then we have, I believe, a 50 and a 45 tooth gear. So there are 2 gears that are sort of close together, but one is a little bit bigger. So take that bigger gear. And it's the same on both sides, so it doesn't matter which side goes down. But we're going to get it. It has a hex-shaped hole in the middle. So we got to get that hex-shaped hole onto our hex-shaped shaft. And sometimes it's hard to get it to line up. You got to kind of turn stuff around to get it to go. If you have to take this out to get it started, that's fine. And then you can drop the whole thing back in to the hole in the bearing. Okay, but we want that pressed down until it's touching the bearing. So if yours is a little tight, make sure it's pressed all the way down. And it should spin nice and freely now because it's supported by that bearing. Okay, then on top is the smallest of the gears that I said was not the motor gear. So this has raised sections on both sides in the middle. And the very small ones don't have that. So make sure you have the one with those raised sections. And this is then going to drop right on top of that same hex shaft. Okay, so like the first stage of our gear ratio is going to be the gear on the sim motor coming in and mating with that bottom gear. So when our motor turns, it's going to make that bottom gear turn. But it turns out that doesn't slow it down enough. So when you go from a small gear to a big gear, that slows down the speed that the output is going to go at. And it's based on the number of teeth. So this one would have to spin around a bunch of times to match this one. Because each time it moves, one tooth on each gear is going to pass by each other. So this one's got to spin a bunch of times to make this one spin once. That's going to slow it down. It's not enough, however. So we're going to end up having a second gear here. So it's a second small to big stage, which is going to slow it down even more. And when you have two stages like that, you actually multiply the ratios. All right, but what we need next is the long output shaft. So there's this shaft here. And it's got hex on one side. It's got rounds on the corners. And then if you look at one end of the hex, there's a little groove in it, a tiny groove cut into it. And that groove is for our E-clip. So the last bag, the Toughbox Mini Kit 3, this has bolts and hardware and stuff like that. We're going to pour that out. And you need to find this piece here. It looks sort of like the letter E. But that is our E-clip. And this has to go into the groove on that output shaft. And there's a few different ways you can do this. You might be able to push it in just with your thumbs or your fingers. It's a little tough to do that. You could get pliers and try to start squeezing it to get it to pop in. The easiest way a lot of the times is to put that down towards the table. And then you can just sort of push down on everything at once. And usually it pops in for me when doing that. You have to be careful, though, as you're going, that the other end of the E stays lined up with the groove. Okay, so I'll try again, pushing down. There we go. And then that popped in, and we can line that up. You might have to wiggle this to get it all the way in the groove, but once it's seated, that shouldn't move much on you. Okay? And that did leave a little mark in my table. So you might want to press down onto a piece of metal or a piece of sacrificial wood if you're on a fancy table that you can't mess up. All right. This is then going to drop into the other bearing. Okay, and then, like I said, we're going to take our 45-tooth gear, or the second biggest gear, and drop that all the way down. So now you can see when the big gear spins, and it's pretty obvious. Like if you look at yours, especially if we can put like a couple of marks on this gear and a couple of marks on this gear. And when I go ahead and spin it, the bottom gear you're going to see is going to spin very fast, and the top one much slower. And that's basically just showing you our gear ratio in action here. Okay, now we have a problem though, which is that our gears, when they mesh together and they run against each other like this, we have kind of steel on steel, metal on metal, where they're rubbing. And if we just put this on the robot and run it, it'll work for a bit, but eventually the teeth are going to wear themselves away. We'll slowly shave off some metal each time, and eventually you might lose some teeth entirely, and then the transmission doesn't work anymore. So we have to do something that's going to reduce the friction and increase the lifespan of our gears. And that is grease. We got to add some grease. So you can find your packet of red and tacky grease. I think there's a little mark to tear it open. And there are a few different ways to apply this, but our goal is to get it not on the top. Nothing is rubbing on the top of the gear, but on the sides where all the teeth are. Each of those little bumps off is a teeth, and we need to get it in the grooves on the top of the teeth all the way around all of our gears. So some people use a brush, and you can sort of like dab it on with the brush as you're spinning stuff. That can work. I'm just going to use my finger for this one. And this one, because it's in the little packet here, usually it squeezes out pretty nicely as well. So we'll start out by putting it on the big gear here, and I'm just going to squeeze it out and turn the gear as I'm squeezing it out. And you'll see eventually that will rub itself onto the small gear as well. So we don't necessarily have to do the small gear too. If we just go all the way around the big gear, we should be pretty much set with our our second stage here. And just be a little careful. Your fingers can get pinched in the gears. If you're turning it by hand, it probably isn't going to be that big of a deal, but it can pinch you a little bit. All right, so I'm just going to squeeze and turn, basically, all the way around on that gear. And we are oozing out of some other places. I wonder if this packet might have had an extra hole. All right, so that's all the way around. You can see there's a bunch of extra that ended up on top or on the sides. Doesn't matter, don't worry about it. You can just leave that alone, but you can spin this around a few times, and you'll see now that basically everything is coated in that grease for those top two gears. Now, we got to do the same thing for the bottom gear. If it helps you, you can take this whole section out. So we can take out our output shaft and just sort of set it off on the side. And that gives you maybe a little bit more access. And I'm just going to do the same thing. Squeeze it out, spin this gear around. If you get little bumps places or huge globs, you can use your finger to kind of work it in. This one's a little bit harder to see. But we want to just get it coated all the way around again, just like our last one. And that looks pretty good. If anything, we might have a little bit too much grease in here, but that's okay. It's not going to hurt anything. Once we close this up, it's going to stay inside. All right, so we can put this back in. And all of that is coated. All right, next step. I'm going to put the grease aside here. All right, now we're ready to start assembling our motors and then attaching the motors to the gearboxes. Now, actually, we have one more step before we do that, and that is we have our two bearings, the last two bearings that we had from before. I'm going to put them onto our two output shafts here. So the round hole bearing is going to go on the middle, the tiny shaft. Remember, that's going to be the top of our robot. That should just pop right on. And then the other one we're going to put onto the hex shaft. And when you put these on, the flange side, remember there's that extra little raised edge, the flange, that should be facing down. That flange side should be towards the gears when we put this on. And you got to line up the hexes, which is sometimes hard. Okay, not sure. Oh, okay. It's just a little tight, so you got it lined up. Sometimes you have to spin the inside to get it to move. But I'm just going to push that all the way down to the bottom until it is touching. Well, that's very tight. Hold on. Work that for a second. Make sure there's nothing stuck in there. Sure our hexes are lined up. Okay. Okay, I don't think it should be quite so tight. Let's take a look at our stuff here. Yeah, we're dragging a little bit on this. I can feel some little raised sections where it was dragging. So I'm going to get a fine file here. And I don't want the metal shavings to end up inside the transmission. So I'm going to take this piece out again and kind of turn it on its side. And so that any shavings will fall down. Actually, I think I need to take the gear off for this too. So let's dump that gear off. And now here on the outside, especially where I see those raised bumps, I'm just going to run my file along it, keeping it nice and flat on that edge, nice and flat on this edge. You can see we scored it in a few places, especially like up here when we were trying to push it on the first time. So I'm just going to make sure all of those are gone. And then this top edge, I'm going to make sure is really nice. And we really don't want to do a lot to this, but let's test the bearing outside of everything where we can kind of hold on to it a little bit better. Okay, it feels like the bearing is a little bit too tight on me here. So if you have a small file, all right, if we have a small enough file to fit inside of the bearing, we might be able to try to file that a little bit and see if it goes. So I'm just going to run this on the edges. There might be some burrs on the inside of the bearing here as well. But the bearing material is also very hard. So we're not going to be able to file a lot of this. I'm just trying to see if there's any raised sections that are causing us a problem. All right, let's try it one more time and see if we can go a little bit farther this time. There we go. All right, that's moving all the way up and down. So there was just a little bit of something stuck on the inside of the bearing, and we just had to find that and knock it off with a file. And now we can reassemble. So we're going to put the gear back on our shaft here. Hopefully you didn't have to do this. Hopefully yours just dropped in fine. And you're at this step where we are dropping our bearing down onto the shaft all the way down until it touches the gear down there. Okay, now this is set for a second. I'm going to slide this off to the side. All right, so we're going to grab two of the motors. These are the sim motors. They're labeled AM0255, but also in the writing it says 12 volt DC 2.5 inch sim motor. And these are what we're going to use to control our robot, or to drive our robot around. All right, so the first step on these sim motors is there are some black washers in this kit, that bag that we dumped out. There are, I guess, 4 of them, because this is enough to do 2 of these motors. So we're going to do 2 washers and slide those all the way onto the motor shaft here. And then our next problem is we want to put the pinion gear on, but if we just slide that on, it can spin freely on the shaft. Like there's nothing that actually connects this to the shaft of the motor. So if you look at the motor, there is a little groove in it. There's a small slot cut into the motor, and that is called a keyway. So that is where we can put our machine key. And so that is these little pieces here. Those are our keys, and those will fit into that keyway. And what you want to do is go back towards the washers, line it up kind of back towards the washers, and then squeeze it in all the way. Then in the gear, there's also a little cutout, a little groove cutout in the gear. And if we line that groove cutout or that keyway up with the key, when we slide this on, now when you turn the gear, it's also going to force the motor shaft to turn because that keyway is there. If your key is sticking out past the gear, you might need to take it out and move it in a little bit more because we're going to slide something on here to hold everything together. So if it sticks out too far, you might need to remove it. You can take it out, you can get little pliers to grab onto it, or you can get something that's small and pointy, like a very tiny Allen wrench, or a snap punch, or a center punch, and just go down in there and you can pry it out as well. If this doesn't slide on when you go to do this, then your key might not be pressed down all the way. So you could get a pair of pliers and try to squeeze it in the rest of the way if it won't go with just your fingers. Okay, once that's in, we're going to use our retaining ring. So that's pieces that look like this. So these are our 2 retaining ring pieces. And they are not like they are directional. There is a different direction for them. So if you look at it on one side, basically there are these little square tabs in the middle. And the idea is when we slide this onto the motor shaft, those tabs, because they're slanted away, the way I'm holding it, they're sort of like sloped in a little bit. when we slide it on, they'll bend out of the way. But if you try to pull it back the other way, they're going to dig into the metal. So if you look at it, the direction the teeth are facing should be pointing away from the motor. You can also see there's like a little bit more of a roundy side on the top. That side's going to be facing in. And then, a little bit more of the scooped open side, that's going to be facing away from the motor. Now, this is really hard to push on with just your fingers. So what I recommend using is a socket of some kind. If you just find a socket that's about the size of this, it has an open hole, so the shaft is going to fit into the socket when you go to press it on. But it will also give you a little bit more leverage and stuff to push with. So I like to get that socket lined up. And then once you're here, you can just sort of push and wiggle, and it should start sliding on. And usually once you get it started, once you kind of get all of the teeth on the end, then it's going to go in a little bit easier the rest of the way. And of course, if you have a shorter socket, I think that actually might work a little bit better. But I'll try to use the longer one so that I can keep my fingers back and you can hopefully see what's going on. So we're just going to keep wiggling it around and pushing. And the goal is basically one side is going to get, like if it gets too crooked, it's going to get hard to move. And so that's why sort of wiggling it around and pushing will always get you kind of the high side pushed in. We're going to push that all the way down until it's just touching the end of the gear. You don't need to shove it in super tight. And in fact, if your gear can just barely wiggle back and forth like mine can, that's about perfect. Because if you squeeze it in super tight, you're adding extra friction there. But if you have just a tiny bit of wiggle, everything is going to spin nice and freely. All right, that was one motor. Let's do a second one here. Exactly the same process. So we're going to start with 2 washers, and then the machine key. And I'm going to go right next to the washers. Okay, then the gear can go on. And then with the socket, we're going to work that retaining ring on. Should that gear's all the way in? There we go. All right. Lost the socket. All right. Keep going. I wonder too, let me try a slightly bigger socket and see if the extra space that it can wiggle makes it a little easier or not. Oh yeah. Definitely use, this is a 3/8 socket. 3/8 socket, much easier. There's more room for it to wiggle back and forth without hitting the motor shaft. All right, that's in. I still have that little bit of wiggle back and forth on the gear, like this. And it spins nice and freely. Okay, these motors are more or less ready to go now into our transmission housing. And they're going to come up from the bottom like this. And we can, if you're very, very paranoid or want to be very careful, you could grease those pinion gears or that pinion gear from the motor before putting it in. But we have so much grease on that big gear when we grease that when this spins around, which is going to be really hard to do now by hand, but when the motor spins around like this, it's going to pick up enough of that grease. You can see just that's from like 2 rotations, and we're almost there. So it's probably going to be okay. You can always add more grease if you need to. But these 2 motors are going to come up from the bottom like that. And you can see how they mate with that bottom big gear. But let me look at one of the motors first. We are going to attach the motor with bolts. But it looks like, at first glance, there are 4 holes that we can put bolts into. But if you look really closely, 2 of the holes have something in them very close to the surface. The other 2 holes are open, and we can go plenty deep and screw stuff in. So we got to line those 2 holes up with the 2 holes on the transmission. And those 2 holes on the transmission are here above and below that gear. Okay, so what I'm going to do is look at this get the 2 empty holes, slide those in. I can see from above too. You might have to turn it a little bit to get the gears to mesh, and then I can see when those holes are lined up. Then, bolt-wise, we have a few different bolts here that we need to look at. Another little bit of a tricky part. So in that bag I dumped out are all of these bolts. And the easiest way to tell the difference is there are longer ones and shorter ones. And the longer ones are the ones we don't want. But the other way you can tell is on the short one, if you kind of spin it around, there's like a patch. It looks like there's a dirty spot on it. So like that's not at all on the longer bolt. But on the short one, it looks like there's this tan patch. And that actually is some, I think it's still nylon, but there's some plastic there. And basically that is a retaining feature. That's going to help lock the bolt in place. So make sure you're using the shorter ones with that patch of tan on it. And it's going to go right onto your 5/32 hex key or Allen wrench. And now we can go back and we can line this up. And if you can get it to drop into the hole, you should be able to get it to start screwing in really easily. And then after a few turns, you'll feel that nylon patch that's going to catch and make it harder to go. Let me see here. I think I'm slightly misaligned. You might have to move it around a little bit to get it to line up. But once you do, it should go in. And now I can feel the nylon is making it a little bit harder. So at that point, I'm going to drop another one in the other hole. That didn't work. Okay, so I think it's easy to put it, if you put it on the end of your Allen wrench, and you kind of keep it tipped sideways, you can usually reach to put that into the hole. And then we will get that caught. There we go. Okay, now this one's a little bit hard. If you have a handled Allen wrench, that basically looks like a screwdriver, but with the 5/32 key size on it, it's much easier to screw this in because that Teflon makes it hard to turn in when I've got the short side sticking out like this, when I have the long side in the bolt because I don't have a lot of leverage. If you can't turn it, of course, you can put the other side in and just work your way to getting tight. And depending on the size of your Allen wrench, it might not fit in that way. So there is one more trick that you can use here, which is if you grab another wrench with the box end, you can put that on, let's see, to the Allen wrench, and you can actually use that to get yourself some extra leverage. So I'm just sliding that kind of onto the head, and then as I go to turn, I still got to kind of hold everything here, but as I go to turn, that ends up being like an extended section on my Allen wrench. So I can use that to get some extra oomph. So go ahead and tighten these all the way down until they are tight. Okay, but remember, you are tightening these into plastic, so there is some point where you could start deforming the plastic. So when it's tight, stop. Next, we'll take the second motor, find the empty holes, line those up, drop that in, and then we've got to get, again, 2 more of those bolts with a Teflon patch started. Sure that stays lined up. And if it sort of isn't screwing in, you can sort of wiggle the motor back and forth. You can also, like if it's one of your first bolts, I can actually stick the bolt through, and then I can see it outside of the housing to make sure it's getting started correctly. And that can sometimes help as well. So we can then do the other one, get the other one started. And I do like to get both of the bolts started before you go ahead and make it tight. All right, and now we just go as much as we can. That's getting really hard to turn. So let's get the wrench on here. And we're almost there. I think we're almost there. There we go. Okay, and then let's get the other one. And there we go. Okay. Wipe off some of that grease that I got on everything. Okay, this is now ready to get attached to the transmission. We have a few pieces left here. So we've got like 3 of these bolts and 4 nuts. This is going to attach the transmission housing to the frame of the robot. I think we just have an extra E-clip. This might be for our second transmission. I don't know. I'll hang on to that. And then you also have this little dowel pin. And the idea with the dowel pin is you can attach this to either end of the output shaft. It can go into this end, or actually on the whole other side, which is now inside through that bearing. I believe if I take this out, we can see it. There is also a hole there that you can put this pin in. And if I put that pin in, and put this back into the bearing here, you can see that pin sticks out the back. So that pin can be used if you want to add a sensor. And there's actually, I think, some holes to screw the sensor in. But that lets you put an encoder on your drivetrain. And the encoder will measure how many times that output shaft has spun. So if you're going to use that, what you want to do is add basically some super glue inside there and press it in as far as it'll go. And then when the glue dries, that'll be fine, because there's no force on it, so just some glue is enough. It's going to be spinning freely inside of the matching encoder piece. We're not going to bother attaching those, but that's what it's for. And if you want to get that sensor functionality, glue it on now, because it's a lot easier. Well, you can still get to it later. You can add glue here and still shove it in through the hole later. So if you change your mind, it's not that big a deal. You don't have to disassemble everything. Okay, so this transmission now is complete. We're going to save those 4 bolts so we can attach it to the frame. I'm going to really quickly repeat that process with my second transmission. So hopefully you were doing 2 at once. If you did 1 at a time, rewind, do it again. I'm going to build the second one really quickly, and then we'll come back and we'll attach both of those to the frame of the robot. Finished the second transmission, so we have 2 of them done now. And I did end up with an extra E-clip in that one too. So I guess you just get a spare. Those things can pop off and get hard to find if you're not careful with them. So that kind of makes sense, but just know that it's okay if you have an extra one. We only needed to use the one. Now, let's orient our transmissions. Make sure the flat part is facing up. That is the top of the transmission. I have my frame over here, also with the top of the frame facing up. And we know the top of the frame is the side with 2 holes, or the side where it's shorter in the middle here on those inside plates. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our transmission, keeping top to top. There are these 2 big holes on the end of our plate here. And the bottom hole is a little bigger than the top hole. So you also know you're doing it right because your bottom bearing is a little bit bigger than the top bearing. Also, that long output shaft is going to go through the bottom hole. So if we line that up through the bottom hole and slide it in, you'll note that the metal on top here should be about the same size as the metal on the transmission. And what we're looking for is if you can line those bearings up, they should slide right into those holes. And the transmission should sit basically flat against the metal. If it's not going all the way in, check to make sure the bearings are getting pushed in and everything is working out there. If you get a bearing that just will not go into the metal, you'll have to slide the bearing off. If you take this out and you take the bearing off of the shaft, then you can actually push it into the metal frame first. And if you need to, you can tap it with a hammer to get it to go. But this is where this is going to go. Our next step then is to tighten our bolts in. So these are the longer bolts that we had left over, the ones without the nylon patch. And these are going to go in from the outside. So they're going to go through the metal first. Also, there are little plastic pins here that will fit into these very tiny holes. So there are, I think, 4 very tiny holes. And those plastic pins will go in just to help make sure everything is aligned correctly. So this is going to go through this hole here. So you have 2 holes on the top that line up with the transmission holes on the back. And the cool part about the transmission holes on the back is they are hex shaped. So if I take the nut, the nylock nut, and I slide that in there, it's actually going to sit inside a little hex shaped area. And what that means is when I go to tighten this bolt down, I'm not going to need to hold the other side with a wrench. The plastic housing of the frame is going to just do that for me. So at this point, we can start tightening in that bolt. And once you get the first one going, it gets a little bit easier. Also, when you're tightening this in, you don't need a wrench, but you do have to make sure that the nut stays inside the hole, the hex-shaped hole. So that's what my thumb is doing. I'm pushing on it to not let it back out. Because I think when you first start these bolts, it could get to the outside. And this one, we should leave it just a little loose just to make sure we can get the other ones to line up. And we're just going to repeat that process. So we'll do the second one on top here. And this one, I did go and grab a handled Allen wrench. So if there are some of these that are a big T-shaped handle, this one just looks like a screwdriver. And that bit is the correct size to go into here. So this can be a little bit faster to put them together if you have one of these. And I think Andymark sells like a whole toolkit that has the sockets that we needed to do the churro bolts, has a handled Allen wrench for the 5/32, but you can also pick these up at any hardware store. All right, then we have two more on the bottom. And these are going to go in here. And again, we can... All right, I was going to try to do it without flipping it over, but it's going to be so much easier if I flip the whole thing over. So let's flip the frame over here. OK, so now bottom is on the top. But man, this is much easier to access. So that's going to go in. And again, we do the nut in on the back. Okay, and then the last one. And this one would make tight, and then we can go back through and tighten all of the other ones down to make sure that they're also all the way secure. Okay, so that's tight. And that's tight. And then we'll flip it back over. And then get these two. Looks good and looks good. All right, so this side is in. Now we're going to do the other side. We'll do this from, I guess we'll look at this from the other angle just in case there's anything you missed there. All right, and once again, we're going to line this up on the hole, slide it through, get the bearings lined up. Squeeze everything in. That looks good. Got some grease coming out of there. All right. Then you can see really good from this side. We've got these hex-shaped holes, so I can just put the nut inside there and hang on to it. And then I can screw the bolt in from the other side. And because that hex-shaped hole, it's basically going to act as my wrench holding everything in place. So there's one. Let's get our second one here. And we'll just hold that in there. And once you get a couple of turns in, now I can't push it far enough for it to release. You can see at this point, I can make the nut spin. It's just out a little bit too far. So you got to hold it in until it gets past that point. Now it's past that point, I can just not worry about it and screw the whole thing in. All right, let's flip it over. And then we've got the two bolts on the top that have to go in. Again, make sure the bolts start on the metal side. The nut fits into the transmission. So kind of hold that. Okay, leaving it just a little loose. The last one. Okay. We'll tighten this one all the way down. And this one. Okay, and then we can do the other two as well, which I can just reach from here. So we'll do the bottom one and the other bottom one. Just snug up all 4 of those bolts. All right, we'll flip this back over so it is right side up, just so we maintain our orientation. In theory, everything is together, but we want to do one more thing just to check and make sure things are working. So if you have a 1/2-inch wrench at this stage, what we should be able to do is move the output shaft. If you put a 1/2-inch wrench on your output shaft, it should move nice and smoothly. You won't be able to do it probably by hand. Oh, I can do it just barely by hand. So depending on how tight it is, you may need a wrench to do it. And I'm going to actually tip this up so I have full range of motion here. Or you could take it off. I guess we could take it off the front of the table instead. That's maybe even easier. But what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to take this wrench and go all the way around. We want to be able to make full 360s, forward and backwards. And what you're doing is you're feeling to see if there's any places where it gets tight or it gets stuck. And mine is nice and smooth all the way through, so I have nothing to worry about. If it starts getting stuck somewhere and it just doesn't go, you could back it off and try to go through again. But if it keeps getting stuck, you're going to have to take the bolts out, take the transmission off, and look inside. Usually when that happens, something inside, usually it's not something is misaligned. Usually something fell inside. There's a bit of debris, some aluminum shavings, an extra piece. Maybe the extra E-clip got inside and it's snagging on that. All right, I'm going to do the same thing on this side really quickly. Make sure my other side is also good. Okay, this one is a little bit rougher, but let's spin it around a few times and see. Okay, yep. So it's a little bit louder, but it is still spinning, and it's pretty smooth all the way around. It feels about the same all the way around. So we should be good. There's one more thing to think about or to worry about when you're doing this, and that is the wires on the back of the motors. And actually, that might be part of what my problem was. That was a little bit of it. But let me see. Bring the front side back over here and kind of show you what can happen. So when you're spinning this and it's nice and smooth, if I take the wires and have the wires touching, so if these wires are touching each other, and I'll just wrap them, twist them together just to really make sure they're connected. What we're doing is when you try to turn this, it's going to feel much stiffer. And if both sides wires are touching together, it's going to feel even stiffer when we go to turn it. It's going to be actually pretty hard to turn. And the reason is, turns out motors can take electricity in and spin, but if you spin them, they actually act as a generator and send electricity out. So what's actually happening when we try to spin it is we're generating electricity, and that electricity is getting fed back into the motor in the opposite direction of the way we're spinning. So we're basically creating electricity to power the motor to make it fight our ability to turn it. So make sure the wires aren't touching when you do that rotate test to make sure everything is nice and smooth. All right, that is the end point for this video. We've got our transmissions assembled and attached to the frame. Next video, we're going to come back and get our wheels prepped, and then we'll be able to finally put the outsides on, button up the frame, and have it completely ready to go. So long for this video, but before we go, let's give a special thanks to Argosy for making this possible, to First and Andymark for their parts and support, and to Team 302 Lake Orion High School for hosting our studio.